The dry sound of the slap echoed louder than the music in the crowded mall, and for a second the whole world seemed to stop just to watch my humiliation. It wasn't the pain in my face that took my breath away, but the shock of realizing that this was really happening, in public, in the United States, in front of strangers who widened their eyes as if I were part of a grotesque spectacle. My cheek burned, my heart raced, and her voice still vibrated in the air, harsh, full of contempt, as if I were nothing more than a mistake that needed to be corrected right there. I knew, in that instant, that my American mother-in-law had never truly accepted me, but I never imagined she would cross such a cruel line. She looked me up and down with that thin smile that mixed anger and superiority, while I tried to swallow the lump in my throat and maintain the dignity that had always been my only defense since I left my country. I remembered the first day I arrived in the USA with a simple suitcase, huge dreams, and the certainty that hard work and respect would be enough. I was wrong. For some people, my accent, my brown skin, and my Latin origin were marks impossible to erase. Around me, I felt curious stares, some supportive, others judgmental. Someone whispered something in English too fast for me to understand, and that only increased my feeling of being out of place. I wanted to disappear, but my legs trembled and refused to obey. I thought of my mother, who taught me never to lower my head, even when the world tries to crush you. I thought of everything I sacrificed to be there, working overtime, enduring veiled comments, fake smiles, and jokes disguised as concern. She kept talking, saying I wasn't good enough, that I didn't belong in that family, that my simple ways shamed her son. Each word was like a blade, and his silence, the silence of the man I loved, hurt even more than the slap. He stood there, torn between the woman who raised him and the woman he chose to love, unable to react. That shattered something inside me. I felt a mixture of shame, anger, and a strange strength growing in my chest, as if that humiliation was awakening a version of myself I didn't yet know. I took a deep breath, tasting the metallic tang of the tears I refused to let fall. I knew that moment wasn't just about a slap. It was about everything that had been accumulating in silence, about every night I cried alone, about every time I tried to prove my worth to people who never wanted to see it. And as I slowly raised my gaze to meet my mother-in-law's, I noticed something change in the atmosphere. The murmur around us grew louder, footsteps drew closer, and an unexpected presence appeared beside me, ready to say something no one there expected to hear. It was at that moment that I understood that that slap wouldn't be the end of my story, but the beginning of something much bigger. And what was about to happen would make that entire shopping mall never forget me. The voice that emerged beside me cut through the air with a firmness that even my mother-in-law take a half step back, and in that instant I knew that something irreversible was about to happen. She wasn't loud nor aggressive, but she carried an authority that silenced the murmur around us as if someone had pressed an invisible button. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it wanted to burst out of my chest as I turned my face, still feeling the sting of the slap, to find out who had decided to stand between me and that public humiliation. She was an elegant American woman with an upright posture and attentive gaze, who introduced herself as the mall manager and demanded to know exactly what was happening. My mother-in-law tried to laugh, that fake laugh she always used to disguise her disdain, saying it was a family matter, nothing serious, just a cultural misunderstanding. That made something inside me boil. A cultural misunderstanding, as if violence could be explained that way, as if I had provoked it simply by existing. As she spoke, I felt the weight of their gazes shift. They were no longer just curiosity or judgment, but discomfort. People began to murmur phrases like, "That's not acceptable, you can't hit someone like that," and each word seemed to push my mother-in-law out of the position of power she had always believed she possessed. For the first time since I met her, I saw a shadow of insecurity cross her rigid face. My boyfriend finally reacted, but not in the way I expected. He tried to downplay the situation, saying we were all stressed, that it was better to leave before it became a bigger problem. That hit me like a second slap, quieter and deeper. I realized with painful clarity that he was still trying to protect my mother's image even after what she had done to me. Something broke there, definitively, and I felt a cold loneliness take over my body, even surrounded by so many. I took a deep breath, tasting the metallic tang of the tears I refused to let fall. I knew that moment wasn't just about a slap. It was about everything that had been accumulating in silence, about every night I cried alone, about every time I tried to prove my worth to people who never wanted to see it. And as I slowly raised my gaze to meet my mother-in-law's, I noticed something change in the atmosphere. The murmur around us grew louder, footsteps drew closer, and an unexpected presence appeared beside me, ready to say something no one there expected to hear. The manager asked my name, if I was okay, if I wanted to call the police. The word police echoed like thunder. My mother-in-law paled, started saying that this would be an exaggeration, that things worked differently in the United States, as if I, a foreigner, didn't have the right to the protection of that country's laws. That awakened a courage in me that I didn't even know I possessed. With a trembling but firm voice, I said that I wasn't okay, that I had been assaulted, and that this couldn't be ignored. As I spoke, I felt years of submission slipping through my fingers. I remembered all the times I swallowed my tears to avoid causing trouble, every family dinner where I was treated as someone temporary, almost disposable. At that moment, I wasn't just speaking for myself, but for all the times I felt inferior for being Latina in a country that demanded perfection from me but denied me respect. The mall security guard approached and the atmosphere became tense. My mother-in-law began to raise her voice, accusing me of wanting to destroy her family, of using the situation to play the victim. Her words no longer had the same effect. The people around me now looked at me with empathy, and some shook their heads in clear disapproval of her behavior. For the first time, I wasn't the stranger in this story. She was. But then something even more shocking happened. A man who had been watching everything from a distance approached and said he had recorded the entire scene from the moment of the slap. He held up his cell phone, showing the screen, and stated that, if necessary, he would hand the video to the authorities. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother-in-law stood motionless, her face completely white, while my boyfriend stared at me as if he were seeing me for the first time. At that moment, I realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The video existed, the truth was recorded, and the decision I would have to make next would change not only my relationship, but the course of my life in the United States. And while the security guard asked to talk in a private place, I felt that the real confrontation was yet to come, and it would be far more painful than any public slap. The narrow hallway of the administrative office seemed to compress my thoughts as I walked beside the security guard, feeling each step as if I were crossing an invisible boundary between who I had been until then and who I would be from that moment on. The icy air conditioning contrasted with the heat that still burned my face, and the heavy silence was only broken by the distant sound of the shopping mall, now muffled, as if the world outside had been switched off. My mother-in-law followed close behind, murmuring harsh words in rapid English, while my boyfriend remained silent, his gaze lost, unable to meet either of ours. We sat in hard chairs, under overly bright light, and the manager asked me to calmly recount everything. When I began to speak, my voice came out weak, but as the words accumulated, something inside me gained strength. I told her about the constant comments, the humiliations disguised as concern, the cruel comparisons, the looks of contempt when I misspoke in English or when my food smelled too different. I told her how that slap hadn't come out of nowhere, but was the culmination of a silent violence that had been growing for months. As I spoke, I saw the manager's expression change. I saw the security guard clench his fists, and that gave me a strange feeling of validation that I had never felt before. My mother-in-law tried to interrupt several times, saying I was exaggerating, that I was too sensitive, that in her culture it was just a necessary correction. That made me laugh, a short, bitter laugh, because I knew that narrative had always worked for her. But not that day, not that time. The video was mentioned again, and the mere fact that it existed seemed to rob her of any authority. For the first time, she had no control over the story. My boyfriend finally spoke, but his words hurt me more than I expected. He said he loved me, that he regretted what happened, but that involving the police would destroy any chance of family reconciliation. Reconciliation? The word sounded absurd in that context. I looked at him and realized with painful clarity that he still didn't understand the depth of what had happened. For him, it was an uncomfortable conflict. For me, it was proof that my dignity had always been secondary. The manager explained, calmly and professionally, that physical assault in a public space was a crime, regardless of family ties. She said I had every right to file a police report and that the mall did not tolerate this type of behavior. As she spoke, I felt a knot forming in my stomach. Reporting meant facing consequences I had feared since arriving in the United States. Fear of retaliation, fear of being seen as a problem, fear of losing everything I had built with so much effort. But it also meant, perhaps for the first time, choosing myself. My mother-in-law then did something unexpected. In a low voice, almost pleading, she said that this would ruin her reputation, that friends, church, family, everyone would find out. She promised she would never disrespect me again, that it wouldn't happen again. But there was something wrong with that request. It wasn't remorse, it was fear of the consequences. And I realized that if I gave in again, I would be signing a silent contract of eternal submission. I looked up and saw the man from the video standing in the doorway, waiting as if he were a witness to destiny. I felt a strange courage course through my body, mixed with sadness and relief. I said I needed a few minutes to think. I left the room and walked to the bathroom where I looked at myself in the mirror. The red mark on my face was already beginning to fade, but the impact of that moment was much more deeply etched in my memory. I remembered the young woman who crossed borders, believing in love and respect, and I felt ashamed for all the times I had remained silent. When I returned, the atmosphere seemed even more tense. Everyone looked at me, waiting for my decision. My boyfriend held my hand, and that gesture, which had previously comforted me, now seemed like a silent plea for me not to shake his world. It was then that I realized that my choice wouldn't just concern that slap, but my entire life from then on. I opened my mouth to speak, feeling my heart race, knowing that the words I would say next would have an impossible weight to undo, and that someone in that room would leave profoundly transformed, for better or for worse. The silence that fell after I opened my mouth seemed so dense that its weight could be felt on the shoulders of everyone in that room. Every pair of eyes was fixed on me, as if my next breath could decide the fate of an entire family. My heart pounded erratically, but strangely, my mind was clear. For the first time since arriving in that country, I knew exactly what I needed to say, even if it cost me everything I thought I had achieved. I said I wanted to file a police report. The words came out firmly, without trembling, and in that same instant, my mother-in-law's face crumbled like an old mask. She brought her hand to her mouth, her eyes brimming not with regret, but with panic. My boyfriend let go of my hand as if he'd been electrocuted. He started talking, saying I was going too far, that it was unnecessary, that we could resolve it at home. At home? The word sounded like a threat disguised as comfort, and I understood that for him, the problem had never been the slap, but the public exposure. The manager nodded respectfully and asked the security guard to call the police. As he walked away, I felt such an intense mixture of fear and relief that my legs almost gave way. My mother-in-law began to cry dramatically, saying that I was destroying her family, that I was ungrateful, that after everything she had done for us, I was paying her back in this way. Each accusation was a cruel reminder of how guilt had always been her favorite weapon. But something had changed. The words no longer paralyzed me. The minutes of waiting felt like hours. My boyfriend paced back and forth, running his hair through his hair, clearly torn between anger and despair. At one point, he approached me and whispered that he never imagined I would be capable of doing that to his mother. That sentence was like a punch to the gut, not because of its harshness, but because of the revelation it carried. He never imagined I would be able to defend myself, and that said it all. When the police arrived, the atmosphere became even heavier. They listened to the accounts, watched the video on the cell phone of the man who kindly agreed to be a witness, and asked direct, objective questions. Seeing the recorded scene, my face being hit, her look of contempt immediately afterwards, was harder than I expected. My hands trembled, but I maintained my composure. It wasn't just about proving something to them. It was about proving to myself that I no longer needed to run from the truth. My mother-in-law tried to justify herself, saying that I had provoked her, that I had been disrespectful, that I didn't understand American values. One of the police officers, with a serious expression, replied that nothing justified physical aggression and that the case would be recorded. When I heard those words, I felt a knot untie inside me. For the first time, an authority figure in that country made it clear that I mattered too, that my rights were not diminished because of my accent or my origin. Then came the most painful moment. One of the police officers asked if I felt safe going home with them. I looked at my boyfriend, perhaps naively hoping for some sign of unconditional support, but I found only silence and a tired, almost resentful look. It was then that I realized that that house was no longer a safe place for me, neither emotionally nor in any other way. In a low but determined voice, I answered no. The reaction was immediate. My mother-in-law shot me a hateful look, as if I had committed the greatest betrayal possible. My boyfriend seemed lost, like a child who had just discovered that the world doesn't revolve around his certainties. The police officers exchanged a discreet glance, wrote something down, and explained the next steps. While they spoke, I felt a deep sadness mix with an unexpected feeling of freedom. When it was all over, I walked out of the room with a borrowed bag and a broken heart, but held high. Outside, the mall continued its normal rhythm, people laughing, shopping, living, completely oblivious to the transformation that had just taken place inside me. But before I could take another step, I heard my name being called, not by him nor by her, but by someone I never imagined would have such a decisive role in that story. And when I turned around, I realized that that voice carried a revelation capable of changing everything again. I turned slowly, the weight of the decision I had just made still anchoring me to the ground. And there he was, the man who recorded the video, the man who, until that moment, was just a stranger in the crowd, but who now seemed to be the key to the next chapter of this story. He was standing a few feet away from me with a serious but not judgmental look. Instead, there was an expression of understanding, almost as if he knew exactly what I was feeling. He was a little older than me, with dark brown hair and a neatly trimmed beard, and his face conveyed a calmness that made me relax, even if only for a second. "I know this must be difficult," he began, his voice soft but firm. "But you did the right thing. You don't deserve to be treated this way." I looked at him, still somewhat dazed, and took a deep breath, trying to find the words. I hadn't expected such clear, such direct support from someone I barely knew. "I don't know what to expect now," I said, my voice trembling. "It's all so confusing. I just wanted to be treated with respect, and now I don't know if I did the right thing. Maybe I went too far." He stepped forward, as if understanding my hesitation, and nodded toward the parking lot. "You've taken an important step. People need to learn that there's no place for that kind of behavior, in any culture, anywhere. It doesn't matter what they say. What matters is how you see yourself. And from now on, you're going to see yourself differently." I felt strangely touched by his empathy, a kind of unexpected kindness at such a turbulent time. He continued, "I am a lawyer. I'm not trying to be your defender, but if you need legal help or just someone to talk to, let me know. I'll be around." I stood silent for a moment, absorbing the impact of his words. He was offering me something that seemed even more valuable than legal help, understanding. I knew that, although the fight was mine, the support of people who truly cared made all the difference. Before I could take another step, I heard my boyfriend approaching hesitantly. He was standing next to my mother, who, for some reason, had arrived there. I didn't know how she had found out, but seeing her there, I realized she was also surprised by the situation. In her eyes, there was a deep shock, but also a slight sense of relief. Relief because perhaps she knew that I was finally taking control of my own life. "Are you really going to do this?" my boyfriend asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "Are you going to let all this destroy our family?" I didn't know if he was talking about my family or his. Both seemed to be falling apart at that moment, but I didn't care anymore. The raw, unforgiving truth was that if he couldn't see my pain and understand why I made this decision, then he could no longer be a part of my life. He wasn't the person I thought he was. "Yes, I will do it," I said, my voice firm but without anger, just a resigned sadness. Because the only thing that truly destroys me is the feeling of erasing myself to please others. That is no longer a choice for me. He opened his mouth to argue, but was interrupted by my mother, who approached and gently put her hand on my arm. "You made the right choice, my daughter," she said, her voice softer than I had imagined, but laden with quiet wisdom. "And I'm here, no matter what happens." I felt a wave of gratitude as I looked at her, and for a moment the weight of the situation seemed to lessen. She was with me. Finally, she understood. The conversation between the three of us continued for a few more minutes, but I was no longer just listening with my ears. I was listening with my heart. And what my heart was telling me, clearly, is that this was the turning point. I was leaving behind something that seemed safe, familiar, but that imprisoned me in every way. And most importantly, I was finally choosing something that was truly worthwhile, my own dignity. The lawyer, who had been observing in silence until then, spoke again. "If you need anything, I'll be available. Just don't forget that however difficult it may be now, you're in control of your story." As he walked away, I took a deep breath. Whatever happened from there, I knew I couldn't go back. The reality that my life and the relationships I had would never be the same became apparent. Not only because the aggression happened, but because I finally began to understand that the respect I sought and the peace I so desired needed to come from within. And as the car arrived to take me away from that shopping mall, I realized that, in the end, this was the day I finally began to recognize myself. The car sped along the road illuminated by cold streetlights, and each kilometer seemed to take me further not only from the shopping mall, but from an old version of myself that I no longer recognized. The silence inside the vehicle was heavy, broken only by the regular sound of the hazard lights reflecting off the windows. My mother was beside me, looking ahead, respecting my silence, as if she knew that this moment needed to be digested internally, without words. I observed my reflection in the glass, the almost invisible mark on my face, and thought about how something so small in the eyes of others had been able to turn my life upside down. When we arrived at the small apartment of a friend of hers who had kindly offered to host me for a few days, I felt the exhaustion finally catch up with me. It wasn't physical, it was a draining of the soul, as if I had spent years holding my breath and only now could I release it. I lay down on the makeshift sofa and closed my eyes, but the scenes of the day kept replaying like a persistent film. The slap, the stares, the video, the police voice, his silence. Every detail hammered in my mind, mixing pain with a strange sense of victory. My phone vibrated for the first time since we left. A message from him, then another, and another. I didn't open any of them. The mere glow of the screen already caused a tightness in my chest. I knew that if I read them, I would find excuses, confused requests, maybe even veiled accusations. Part of me still wanted to believe that he would understand, that he would wake up from that emotional torpor and finally choose to stay by my side. But a larger, more lucid part whispered that some people only understand losses when they become definitive. In the middle of the night, another name appeared on the screen. The lawyer. He said he had thought it over and felt it was important to warn me about something. My heart raced. I answered in a low voice, trying not to wake anyone. On the other end, he explained that while talking to the police, he heard my mother-in-law mention something that didn't seem trivial. According to him, there was a history, other hushed-up situations, other people who had remained silent. That made my stomach churn. The slap I received might not have been an isolated incident, but just the only one that came to light. I hung up and sat in the dark, feeling the weight of that information. If there were other victims, my silence now could either protect or condemn them. The responsibility fell on me like an avalanche. At the same time, I felt fear, real fear, because confronting someone accustomed to never being contradicted could mean retaliation I couldn't yet foresee. For the first time since arriving in the United States, I realized that my struggle went far beyond a failed relationship or a family conflict. It touched something deeper, something more dangerous. The next morning, I woke to an unexpected notification, an email from an unknown number. I opened it with trembling hands and felt the ground disappear beneath my feet. It was a veiled threat, written politely, almost cordially, saying that I should think carefully before proceeding, that certain decisions could complicate my life in that country. There was no signature, but I knew exactly where it came from. This was no longer just emotional. It had become a power game. My mother read over my shoulder and held my hand tightly. Fear silently bound us together. I felt like running away, catching the first plane and disappearing, but something inside me refused to back down. Every humiliation I suffered, every tear swallowed, every night I felt smaller than I truly am, all of that now pushed me forward. I knew I was on the edge between protecting myself and remaining silent again, or facing something that could change not only my story, but the stories of others as well. A few hours later, the phone rang. Unknown number. I answered, my heart pounding. On the other end, a trembling female voice introduced herself and said that she had seen the video circulating in private groups. She said that what happened to me had also happened to her years ago, and that I wasn't alone. My legs went weak. As she spoke, I realized that this story was far from over. In fact, it was only beginning, and the next step would require a courage I didn't yet know if I possessed.